Today we're going to be showing you how to put together your KMX Venom.
First, we'll go over what your KMX kit contains.
You should have 2 front wheel assemblies, a back wheel, a boom, a seat, and a frame.
Next, we'll go over the contents of the small parts box. You should have a derailleur hanger, a tie rod bolts, spacers, and washers, your steering knuckle assembly bolts, washers, and bushings, a quick release skewer for the rear wheel, a rear mudguard, and an 8-speed chain. A crescent wrench, screwdriver, and tape measure will be very helpful in assembly. First, mount the trike in an assembly stand. We'll be using the KMX stand, which is not included in the kit. Next, we'll be installing the front wheel assemblies. To install the front wheel assemblies, you'll need the 2 M10 bolts, 4 bushings, 4 washers, and 2 M10 nuts, as well as 2 plugs. Grab one of your steering assemblies and install 2 of the bushings. There will be 1 bushing for the top and 1 for the bottom on each steering knuckle. The bushings don't have an extremely tight fit, so you may need to hold it in place. First, slip the knuckle over the steer tube and insert the M10 bolt and washer. Next, take your M10 nut and washer and install them on the bottom side of the M10 bolt. You'll just repeat the process for the opposite side wheel assembly. Go ahead and secure the M10 bolt with a 6mm hex wrench and a crescent wrench. Next, install the black plugs to keep out weather and dirt. Next, we're going to install the tie rod. You'll have 2 large spacers, 2 bolts, 2 thin washers, 2 thick washers, 2 black bump stops, and 2 nuts. First, install a thin washer on the bolt, then send the bolt through the tie rod end. Next, you'll install the thick spacer. Then install the bolt into the steering knuckle. You'll then install the black bump stop, the thick metal washer, and then the nut. All of the chain tubes should run on the underside of the tie rod. Be careful not to over-tighten the bolt, as you can crack the bump stop. Next, we're going to be installing the rear derailleur hanger. This will require the Phillips blade screwdriver. Next, we're going to be installing the rear derailleur. The rear derailleur is attached to the right-hand wheel assembly. You'll need to cut the zip ties in order to run the cabling and the derailleur. Running the cable up through the bottom in between the frame and tie rod will help keep it out of the way And there should be clips on the frame that will keep the cable from wiggling around and rubbing the frame. Using a 5mm hex head wrench, install the rear derailleur on the rear derailleur hanger. Now we're going to install the rear wheel. You'll need to use the quick release we looked at earlier. First, unthread the end of the quick release. Then remove one of the springs. Next, starting from the brake side of the wheel, send the quick release all the way through the hub. Then install the spring with the wider part towards the quick release nut. When installing the rear wheel, make sure that you get the axle all the way up into the dropouts. Then tighten the axle nut and close the quick release lever so that everything is nice and snug. Next, we'll install the seat. You should have 4 plastic shims, 2 threaded plates, 2 unthreaded plates, and 4 M5 bolts. First, put the seat on the frame and install the lower seat stays into the upper seat stays. This will help keep the seat in place when you install the lower seat hardware. Use the shorter M6 bolts to secure the seat stays. Next, we're going to install the lower seat hardware. First, install the unthreaded metal plate, and then install a shim over that. Next, you'll put a shim in between the bottom of the seat and the frame of the trike, followed by a threaded metal plate through the seat frame to secure. When tightening the seat bolts, you want to make sure that you tighten them equally and incrementally to make sure that each bolt has enough threads to hold the seat securely in place. Next, we'll be installing the boom, which should have the front crank and derailleur already installed. First, insert the boom into the frame. Sometimes the black shim can cause some trouble, but it should slide right in. The boom is secured in place by the 2 bolts on the left side of the frame. Next, we're going to go ahead and install the chain. It's usually easiest to start at the front of the trike, running the chain through the front derailleur. As the chain comes off of the front crank, you'll want to run the chain into the chain tube that coincides with the idler pulley in the middle of the frame. This is referred to as the power side chain, as it's the side of the chain that pulls on the wheel to get it to rotate. Once you've threaded the chain through all of the power side chain tube, you'll then want to run it through the derailleur. You'll first run the chain over the top of the first jockey wheel, making sure that you run the chain in between the jockey wheel and the chain guard, then across the back side of the lower jockey wheel and forward towards the front of the trike. Loop the chain so it doesn't pull back through the chain tube. Next, we're going to run the return side of the chain through the long, unbroken chain tube. Once you've got the chain run through the return side chain tube, you'll use the 8-speed master link provided to connect the two ends of the chain. Next, we're going to install the front derailleur cable, which is again zip tied to the left wheel assembly. This cable will also run in between the tie rod and the frame. There will be another set of black clips allowing you to secure the cable to the frame. The cable itself will be run up through the bottom of the boom. The noodle between the end of the cable and the cable housing will act as a cable stop. Next, you're going to run the cable underneath the cable pinching bolt on the front derailleur and secure it using a 5mm hex head wrench. Finally, we're going to be installing the pedals. Be sure to grease the threads to ensure that they can be removed if necessary later on. Each pedal is stamped with an R and an L, indicating which side of the trike that each pedal is installed on. One pedal will have a left-hand thread, which will mean that you can stand in front of the trike, hold the spindles and rotate the crank backwards, and the pedals will thread themselves in. Secure the pedals using your crescent wrench, a 15mm box end wrench, or a pedal wrench. Last but not least, we'll be installing the rear mudguard. You'll need a 3mm hex head wrench for this install. Simply wrap the clamp around the top of the seat frame and install the bolt, securing the clamp in place. Thank you for watching our KMX assembly video. Please see our other videos regarding tuning and adjustment.